Welcome to In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. What is the TPP? I know, I didn't know a few months ago either, but we need to know about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's yet another free trade agreement being negotiated right now under cover of darkness. In fact, you'll hear from a U.S. congressman who, like the rest of us, can't even get the text of what's being discussed. The TPP, this hour on In Deep.
I'm called Little Buttercup, dear Little Buttercup.
In case you can't tell,
politics is weird and creepy.
In case you can't tell, our engineer Matt has been having a great deal of fun with his audio programs. That is our new introduction for our demented sidekick, Buttercup. GottaLaff is bringing us the news of the week through her own demented filter. Hey, girl.
Do you know that somebody called me Buttercup on Twitter now? That's really, you've got influence. Anyway, I wanted to share something with you. I found a cure for insomnia.
Oh?
Yeah, you just load some audio of Senator Rob Portman onto your iPod, and apparently this is more effective than Ambien and Lunesta combined.
That can't be right, because he's being pushed as a possible running mate for Romney, so surely he's got to be vivacious and attractive and energetic.
Well, you know, running mates aren't supposed to outshine their presidential candidate running mate, and he's not going to have any problem with that, although in Romney's case, I think a loaf of Wonder Bread could upstage him. But anyway, it turns out, by the way, a strike against him is also that he was George Bush's budget director. This is not good. That's even worse than boring.
Oh, good Lord. Let's get the architect of the Titanic on board, shall we?
Exactly. Well, Stephen Colbert was saying that a Romney-Portman ticket would amount to the bland leading the bland. And then the Wall Street Journal reported that, and this really ruffled Portman's bland little feathers. He called, the Wall Street Journal called him dry as dust. Ooh. So Rob Portman said, I told my staff that I'm so boring that I didn't even know I was boring. And he said this, and I'm quoting from the Washington Post, at a big conference table surrounded by several expressionless members of his staff, which means that they're boring too.
You never know that was a job qualification.
Oh, man. Okay, we're stuck with him, I guess. And well, maybe not. We'll see.
Well, we're stuck with Romney. We're definitely stuck with Romney, at least for the time being. But he's really been out there making just brilliant quotations for the grist mill, for the media mill.
Oh, man. He said on May 4th that over 4% unemployment would be no cause for celebration. And then on May 23rd, which was, just recently, he said we'd get the unemployment rate down to 6% if you were elected. So I guess, he's such a super duper businessman that not only can he turn his country around, but he can turn his own words around.
What is the sound of one Etch-a-Sketch shaking? Exactly. It's the new Zen question.
And, George Bush was also a businessman who actually did turn the country around. And by that, I mean on its head. So I think Mitt needs his Bane examined, is what I think.
Ouch. Boy, Bane is that's finally gotten some traction out there. He can't shake that off.
Oh, I'm really, really glad to hear that. They are trying to turn it around and say, you can't attack free enterprise, but it's too late. And by the way, his solutions to the whole economy thing are to get rid of, quote, Obamacare, to drill for natural gas and oil and coal. I can't drill for coal, but, chop away and get coal, and get a handle on the deficit. These are his plans. And what he doesn't realize is that the Congressional Budget Office predicted last January that the unemployment rate is already on its way down to 7% by 2015 and to 5.5% by 2017. So everything he's saying is just a big pile of dung.
She says, with no opinion whatsoever.
Of course not.
And we've saved the best for the last here. This one was so weird when I first heard it. I thought, okay, this isn't true. This is an Onion story, but it's not.
I know, huh? It's Ronald Reagan's blood was for sale. Not really. It was a vial of blood that was taken after he got shot by John Hinckley Jr. And this is dried blood in this vial with his name on it. So it's, got some historical value for some reason.
Ew.
I know. And it was being sold by a man who's late.
It's the Gipper.
That was perfect. Anyway,
Nothing ends here.
This guy whose late mother took it from the lab with permission a few weeks after these tests were made with this vial, this is the guy, the man who's selling it or trying to sell it. And apparently nobody from the foundation or the family was complaining to the auction people, although now Michael Reagan is livid. There were privacy issues and, all kinds of things. There's an investigation going on and blah, blah, blah. And the guy tried to interest the Reagan Library in buying this vial, but they weren't interested. And he said that the lab director told his mom that she could take it. So the seller claimed, this is so weird, that he was a supporter of Reagan's and he believes that Reagan would have wanted him to sell the vial rather than donate it. Ew!
But you know what? It puts me in mind. I mean, there are so many ideas about cloning. It terrifies me. Any of his DNA can be in any hands anywhere. I mean, we have Dolly the sheep, and then we'd have Ronnie the new president.
Romney the elephant?
We
oh,
will
my
never
God.
Compromise our principles and standards.
I thought I'd never have to hear that voice again.
We've heard it 3 times now. Anyway, there's an update. I just literally saw it before we started talking, and that is that the sale, according to Washington Post, the sale has been canceled. So all this fun was for nothing.
But you know what? Nothing. It added to the inimitable GottaLaff news review, for which I thank you, and I guess Ronnie and his blood. Thanks, girlfriend.
Thank you.
GottaLaff with her news flashes from thepoliticalcarnival.net. This is In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. It is conceivably one of the most important pieces of international legislation currently being worked on, and I'm willing to bet to my last dime in my pocket that you know nothing about it. It's the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership. See, I told you hadn't heard about it. There are a number of issues with it, one of the largest of which, in terms of us being voters and active citizens, the fact that most people who do know that it's in existence, who do know that it's being negotiated between multiple countries, including the United States, have never seen it, even though it is set to become, or at least has the possibility of becoming, the set policy of the United States. Secondly, an issue has come back again that we've heard over and over in these days of the internet, and that is intellectual property, copyright. What happens to copyright as it crosses the seas, as it crosses international borders, and how much of those rights are being given away with the negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership, henceforth referred to in this show as the TPP, so I don't run out of breath. We're going to start things off with the International Intellectual Property Coordinator for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Maira Sutton. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I understand that every time we talk about what's in this agreement, we're talking about bits and pieces that have been leaked out. What's the justification, or have we been given a justification, as to why something with potential impact on all Americans is being discussed under the covers, so to speak?
Well, the United States Trade Representative, or the USTR, is claiming that confidentiality is needed so that all the 9 countries that are negotiating this agreement can put everything on the table and say what their concerns are, and talk about what their actual economic needs are so that they can figure out what the most desirable agreement should be for all of them.
And I understand I'm not asking you as Maira Sutton, I'm asking you as a representative of the EFF. Does that hold water to the EFF? Do they consider that to be a rational stand?
No, especially given that the interests that they are representing, both the United States and these various countries, are the interests of these big industry corporations. So at least in the United States, most of all the concerns that are actually being addressed in the TPP are the concerns of, big pharmaceutical companies, and most concerning for us, which is the, companies like the Recording Industry Association of America, the RIAA, or the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA. And they are creating laws that would uphold, very restrictive copyright enforcement measures that actually ultimately hurt users, smaller upstart tech companies, and creators, all for the benefit of, upholding their sort of antiquated business model. And they're, what's clear, at least from the IP chapter, which is what the EFF is concerned with, is that a lot of their concerns are based upon a business that is quickly diminishing. They have had a monopoly over content, over entertainment, over music, things like that. But the reality of the internet is changing the world in terms of how people consume content, how people find new works, and they're sort of in denial and putting their fingers in their ears and trying to sort of buy their way out of the actual fact that their whole big monopoly is being undermined by these much more innovative entrepreneurial business models.
It occurs to me that this is more important for the average person than perhaps it would have been several decades ago, because who holds copyright to something used to be an issue for the writer, the producer of pieces of art, perhaps that sort of thing. Almost all of us are creators now, to some extent. Granted, the internet, we're all creating little videos, we're all writing blogs. How much does this particular agreement have to do with the average person out there?
Well, I'm actually not sure how many people actually apply for copyright over, for example, if someone makes a remix video of, kittens dancing to some music, if they actually copyright that sort of work. I doubt that they do, because, it's sort of part of our culture, our current new culture, that understands the value of, remixing and collaborating and, finding new works of art. So in terms of the average person, I think it's less it's less impactful in terms of the way in which these copyright laws could maybe benefit them. It's much more, it actually hurts them, based upon the fact that a lot of the enforcement mechanisms that these would, embolden in the U.S. and around the world would actually deter people from, creating things.
Maira Sutton is the Electronic Frontier Foundation's International Intellectual Property Coordinator. One of the elements that, at least as we understand in the TPP, and I want to emphasize again, it's not like we have a complete draft of it in front of either of us here, but the intellectual property chapter looks at extending endless copyright terms, which have already been controversial within our borders, conceivably across the globe, or at least to these many partners that we're looking at, the many countries that are involved in TPP negotiations. Can you explain endless copyright and why that's problematic?
To give some context, the U.S. has the most extensive copyright terms in the world by far. It's problematic because, for example, if you take Mickey Mouse, for example, the person that supposedly created Mickey Mouse, it's actually even debatable that Walt Disney himself thought of the idea. The person that created that content is long gone, and so when the underlying justification for having any term of copyright is to, protect the creator from having their works infringed upon, it undermines that whole argument when it's extended much longer than their actual the length of their life. So how do you say that? I personally could say, oh well, if I make this drawing and I understand that this drawing would be protected for 70 plus years, it doesn't really motivate me to create new things, first of all, and secondly, it goes beyond what's actually suitable for a culture that is always remixing and creating new works, and so it hurts culture, and it also it prevents new ideas from being able to be circulated around our economy and our society.
Well, I want to probe that a little bit because I want our audience to really understand what's at stake here. If you take, for example, Mickey Mouse, and you say, well, Walt Disney, who created Mickey Mouse, he died many years ago, but in the meantime, he built up an organization of artists and engineers and publicists and, all kinds of divisions of every conceivable kind that now have a career that is dependent upon that figure of Mickey Mouse and all of his attendant animal friends. So can the case be made that the idea that the extended copyright or the endless copyright goes on to protect someone more than Walt Disney? How would the EFF answer that?
Well, sure, there are many people that might benefit based upon the copyright of Mickey Mouse, but when you consider the fact that there are all these all these artists that, might want to just use the icon of the circle with the two, circles for the ears and use that for some other work, for example, or do any kind of, parody or satire based upon that, especially when we're surrounded by these icons, when we are, when we are influenced by these cultural things, it's, hard to justify maybe 1,000 people's jobs for the millions of people out there that might be in fear of creating works and creating new things because they might be faced with $150,000 infringement or imprisonment if they're faced with a claim of infringement. So sure, it's hard to say that it's all bad, I guess. I mean, there are those few people that, might benefit from it, but you have to look at the bigger picture and understand that the overall negative effects of such expansive copyright terms needs to be addressed in creating laws because, laws don't benefit the few. It needs to understand what the actual overall effect of it is on society.
And when you stretch this out to an international picture, which is something that the TPP, would propose to do, you take something like fair use, for example. Fair use in the United States is argued constantly. Fair use is a defense and not a law. How much time within a what musical stretch or how extensive that circle in the two ears can be, that kind of thing is always in court. What happens if you expand copyright and the concepts of fair use to an international picture? I mean, who's even in charge anymore at that point?
Exactly. And what the TPP would do is leave the enforcement to these domestic courts. And so one of the many, many problems with TPP and other similar international trade agreements that would, regulate the internet and copyright is that it puts an excessive burden on these court systems that, frankly, might not even have the bandwidth to take this on. And so, and another problem is that these copyright terms, we've actually seen around the world that the claim of copyright can be used to silence speech, saying that, oh, this person use this image or use this imagery, so we're going to slap them with a huge fine or shut their website down. And given that many of these companies and hosting companies are so fearful of these infringement cases, they will actually take down content before even determining that it's actually a real legitimate claim. So and so there is a huge burden on courts, and it also, and because of that huge burden on courts, companies may just determine that, okay, this is just an infringement case. We're not even going to deal with it because we just, don't have the time.
I'm talking to Maira Sutton. She's the International Intellectual Property Coordinator with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She's with us for a few more minutes. And shortly we'll be talking with John Garamendi, California congressman, who is already on the record with saying that he opposes the TPP. He's already on the record saying he opposes the TPP. And then Tim Johnson with the California Free Trade Coalition will be joining us as well. He'll be talking about this for you activists in the states who want to get involved in fighting the TPP. He's got lots of ideas for you. This is In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. Stick around.
Timbuktu, it's the outsourced workers blues. They took away my health plan and that filled me with the fear. I was bouncing around on ads looking for a new career. Crisis is opportunity if you know how to look. I wrote the tale of my travail and sold 1 million books. You can't go running blind through life, you got to pay attention. A kick in the ass is a shove in the right direction. A kick in the ass is a shove in the right direction. Lover left me in a most unpleasant way, and if she had a reason she was not prepared to say. She took her things and drove away, but she left behind this book. The title was intriguing, so I thought I'd take a look. So many things I'm glad to know are contained within that text. If you deal with what you've been through, you can deal with what comes next. If you are alert enough, you can make a course correction.
Welcome back to Indie. We're talking about the TPP. That is the trade agreement that's being negotiated between many countries, including the United States. The Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership, a super secret agreement that for various reasons has not been revealed in its entirety to U.S. citizens. However, the Electronic Frontier Foundation managed to get hold of part of what they were talking about, at least back in February 2011, and that's the element we're talking about right now. It's the part that talks about copyright provisions, which would go from a matter of state and federal jurisdiction to a matter of international agreement. My guest is with the EFF. She's their International Intellectual Property Coordinator, Maira Sutton. Maira, we were talking a little bit about the various pieces of this legislation, but what's going to matter to a lot of people here is what's the price attached to this? If you get caught in violation of this international agreement, do we know what price we're talking about having to pay?
At least in the U.S., you can face statutory damages, which are these preset amounts for each case of infringement, and they could face up to $150,000 per infringement. And that's not even considering what the actual damage is on the rights holder themselves. And so they're actually fighting for these preset statutory damages because, it's actually really hard to quantify. And, likely there really isn't an actual damage that is quantifiable for these, recording industry and motion picture industry companies. Another one is the criminal section of the intellectual property chapter that we saw from last year, which is that a individual could face actual jail time if it's proven that they've had direct or indirect motivation for financial gain. And, indirect motivation for financial gain is a creepily broad terminology to use. So you could really, claim that a kid, giving a CD to his sweetheart may be determined as indirect motivation for financial gain because, the kid didn't have to pay for this gift. So it's really scary stuff.
I can't help but point out, and I'm sure it's obvious to everyone who's listening, our show has done an awful lot of coverage of ALEC. We've done a lot of coverage about, corporate financing of campaigns, and this just all seems to fall in the same category. It's the moneyed interests getting together quietly to discuss provisions that, if they're enacted into law, if they become the policy of the United States, it's essentially going to benefit the people and corporations who have money over the little guy. Or am I exaggerating that description?
No, you're not. The problem with the TPP is this chapter, but it's also the fact that civil society and the public has been completely shut out of the negotiations. We haven't been able to see the draft text as we've talked about, and we've been shut out of these negotiations that have been occurring since 2009. For example, in February, they had a meeting in a luxury hotel in Beverly Hills with many of, representatives from motion picture and recording industry folks around, and we had rooms reserved at this hotel to sleep there and to have stakeholder meetings to tell them what our concerns are. But the hotel actually called us and canceled our reservations on us because of this confidentiality. At the same time, that later that week, those negotiators from around the world were able to go on a multi-hour tour of a movie studio. And so who knows what they were talking about, but it's really likely that, this is just one, symptom that we've seen of, private industry folks, influencing our international legal agreements.
Well, you used the word creepy earlier, and it's uncanny because one of our ALEC stories, the journalists who have attempted to cover ALEC, one of them was thrown out of his hotel room. I mean, the parallels are just amazing. And he was asked to leave his hotel because, quote unquote, ALEC doesn't want you here. And now, here you are. You're not allowed to snore in proximity to the people who are negotiating the TPP.
Exactly.
So can you talk about, I'm sure our listeners who are an activist bunch by nature, they'd like to know why they haven't heard of this before. Or what I know the EFF has tried to get word out. Why is it not getting traction in the press?
Well, they're doing a great job of keeping it a secret. We've actually had a huge push in the last couple of weeks to get attention to this. 2 weeks ago, the Yes Men, which is a what would you call that? A group of guys who does sort of satire and goes after corporate interests in a sort of comedic way. They did a presentation at this negotiation. They were able to register, and this guy posed as someone who was giving an award to the ambassador Kirk of the USTR and say, we're giving you this reward for the corporate power tool reward. So, and so
that was a beautiful piece of political theater, a gorgeous piece of political theater.
Yeah. So the problem is we just need to get creative to get people to care about it. It's really hard for people to know how these legislations would impact their lives, without having to sort of condense the actual, the nitty-gritty of these agreements. So that's really our job.
Well, I'm glad you're doing it. Maira Sutton, thank you so much. And we're going to put all the links to your work and all your suggested links up on our website so people can check you out and see how they can help. Thank you.
Great, no problem.
Maira Sutton, Electronic Frontier Foundation's International Intellectual Property Coordinator. Coming up next year on In Deep, it's John Garamendi, California Congressman, who has already weighed in against the TPP. Stick around for more. This is In Deep. In Deep Radio is a production of Talkback Media. We are supported in part by our listeners. Talkback Media produces discussions on key political, social, and cultural issues available for live digital audio and video venues. Learn more online at indeepradio.com. And if you are in a position to help us keep on the air, click one of the PayPal links on the side of the page. One-time gifts or a small monthly donation, whatever works for you. We appreciate it. Thanks. Our topic this hour is the TPP on In Deep Radio. I'm Angie Coiro. Thanks for tuning in. Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership, TPP. And as we just heard, that's of great concern to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, focusing on intellectual property. There's more to the partnership, and a lot of it has to do with why the U.S. knows so little about it, the average citizen. We're talking now to California Congressman John Garamendi of the state's 10th District. And Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Delighted to do so. This is a really important issue.
And it doesn't seem to be getting much traction. Do you have any impressions as to why there's so little awareness that this is happening?
Well, most trade deals really don't hit the public's attention until they're finalized, and then everybody goes, oh my, this can't possibly be the case, and then a big ruckus occurs. But we need to really get on top of this one early because there's some serious, serious problems in it.
Well, in my conversation with Maira Sutton, and I asked her about why there's so much privacy about this. In fact, the work that they've been doing at the Electronic Frontier Foundation is based on one piece of the provision that came out in February 2011. It was leaked. And she talked about the fact that this is presented as something where the economic interests of the countries involved need to be protected. They're essentially bearing their economic soul. They have to be able to put everything on the table, and thus the privacy is necessary. What's your take on that?
I think that's baloney. I think this is a democracy, and I think we the public, and certainly the representatives of the public, ought to be aware of what is going on, and we ought to be stating our views early in the process rather than trying to stop something after it's been decided on by numerous countries. So, no, we ought to go at it right now, and we ought to know what's happening. And like I said, most of these trade deals are kept secret until the final because of the outrage that would occur early on in the process if people knew what was going to happen to them.
So who in the U.S. government is privy to the actual text, what's being discussed?
Well, I think we're going to see some members of Congress aware of what's going on. Myself and many other members of Congress wrote a letter to the President and to the trade representative who's negotiating all these things, saying, hey, we need to know. We laid out several issues that we're concerned about, and I suspect that the issues that you raised, which were not part of our letter, because we didn't even know that was a concern, will be included in a subsequent letter. So this is the process that unfortunately we have to go to. We don't, just the normal process is the public and Congress is not aware until the final. And at that point, it's a big, difficult task to change it.
So am I understanding correctly that if you were to call the trade representative now and say, I'm a U.S. congressman, I would like a copy of this to share with my constituency, they would just say no?
I wouldn't say that yet. Let's see what happens to this letter that we wrote. It's only a couple of weeks old now. And we should hear back from the trade rep and the president. Call me back in a week, and if we don't have the information, then, yeah, maybe you're right. We'll see. They should be giving us the information.
One of the focuses of the show ever since we first came on the air has been the influence and access that corporations have to legislation in the U.S. We've had a big focus on ALEC, for example. Is that at play in this at all? Are there corporate entities that have access to information the average citizen does not about this negotiation?
Well, certainly the big American corporations and some small corporations are engaged in these negotiations early in the process, stating their views on how it should be structured so as to protect them from foreign competition or to give them an advantage in some foreign country. And the particular issues that we're concerned about have to do with the access of foreign countries and foreign corporations into the American market, regardless of the Buy America provisions. So we basically are trading away access to small countries' markets in exchange for their access into one of the world's biggest markets, that is the United States. A very, very bad trade, but that seems to be what has happened on many of these, quote, free trade agreements, which apparently are free access to the American market and limited or maybe access to another very small market, which is a minor benefit to the total U.S. economy and major detriment when you consider that we now have serious foreign competition undercutting American corporations. And that's a problem. That's a very serious problem.
Well, to put that in some local terms, and this is a show that airs nationally, but one of our local examples here is that the Bay Bridge is undergoing construction. It's not the iconic bridge that the Golden Gate is, but it has a lot of prominence. It's a very big budget item, and it looks as though most of the steel going into the Bay Bridge is elsewhere. And as a professional voiceover, I've been voicing spots for a transit project here, the Bay Area Rapid Transit, BART, where it looks as though the new trains may be coming from outside of the country or built from outside the country. And so California is trying to deal with this on a state level. Is that right?
Well, both state and national. Clearly, the Bay Bridge is the poster child for why you want to have Buy American laws. Clearly, it's the biggest public works project ever in California's history. And a good portion of the steel came from China. Thousands of jobs are in China and very, very few in the United States. The savings were really non-existent because of delays and bad product and bad welding and other problems that occurred. One example. The other example is the Bay Area Rapid Transit System going out and buying $3.2 billion of new trains. Two bids came in. One bid was 66% by Bombardier, and the other bid was 95% by Alstom. Both foreign countries, but Alstom said, we'll build 95% of the value of the content of these trains in the United States. Bombardier said 66%. Federal law required 60% minimum content in America. And so 66 was enough. They went with that. $1 billion of American jobs gone as a result of that. But this trade agreement makes it even worse. The trade agreement, as we understand it, being put together right now, would remove the Buy America requirement, period. In exchange for America having access to the Canadian market where Bombardier is located, they would have total access to the American market and no Buy America requirements at all. That is a major concern. Now, Buy America has been in the American law, usually waived for the last 50 years. We're going to eliminate most of those waivers so that there really is a strong Buy America law so that we can make it once again in America.
I'm talking to Congressman John Garamendi. He's joining us from his Washington office. He represents California's 10th District in Washington, D.C. Congressman Garamendi, as I'm listening to you describe this process and listening to the work that you're doing on Buy American issues, it strikes me that perhaps the best idea in negotiating this kind of partnership, as we've been discussing with TPP, might not be best left to the hands of a trade representative, might better be left to the hands of the U.S. Congress? Or is that the kind of place where it gets bogged down and nothing happens? Because as it sounds, as you and I discuss it, the best interests of the American people may not be represented here.
Well, I think that's exactly the case. There's undoubtedly some company in the United States is quite happy to have access to these Pacific countries. But I can guarantee you those Pacific countries really want access to the American market. And if it's a deal where we have total access to their markets and they have total access to our markets, we lose. We lose big time. And this is part of the reason why the United States manufacturing sector has declined by 40% in the last 25 years. We used to have nearly 20 million Americans working in manufacturing. Now we're just over about 11.5 million. And we're losing billions upon billions of dollars of wages. Just in the 2001 to 2010, we lost over $250 billion of manufacturing wages, and 5.5 million manufacturing jobs were lost. A good portion of that had to do with trade agreements that allowed countries to access the American market and for us to have access to very small markets. Not a good negotiation strategy in any situation.
We have a little over 60 seconds left, Congressman, and I wanted to ask you about the absence of China and the rather informal involvement of Japan at this point, which, of course, in terms of trade, Japan and China are very important to us. Why are they not part of the discussion?
Well, I really don't know the answer to that. We have trade agreements with Japan already. China is a major problem for the United States. Their currency is clearly undervalued, giving them a 20 to 25% advantage on pricing. And the environmental and work conditions and all of those things in China are abysmal compared to the United States. So we're at a very, very significant disadvantage with China. We've got to end that. And just this last week, the Department of Commerce instituted tariffs against Chinese photovoltaic systems because they are cheating. They are using government subsidies to underprice and to sell below the actual cost. They can't do that, so now there's a 34% tariff on those, and that's a good thing. Finally, we're beginning to wake up and say, hey, we're going to protect America. We're going to protect American jobs, and by God, we're going to make it in America once again.
I'm glad you brought up those solar issues because that's important, too. Congressman Garamendi, I really thank you for your time and for your efforts.
Good. Thank you.
And we'll post a link to his website on our website at indeepradio.com.
I don't know
It's In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. Thanks for staying with us as we continue to discuss TPP, another trade association agreement, this time across international borders. And it's raised a lot of concern. We heard earlier in the hour from Maira Sutton at the EFF. They're primarily concerned with the intellectual property ideas that are being internationalized here, when many of them aren't even settled in the States. John Garamendi, California congressman, talked to us earlier as well. And we're taking a slightly more localized view of this now. For any of you listening in any state across the country, if you want to be involved, there's some very localized sort of moves you can make. And we're talking to Tim Robertson. He's with the California Fair Trade Coalition to give us some ideas. Tim, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Angie.
So we talked a little bit before the show, you and I, and we talked about the fact that even though we're talking about a national, even international issue, that a lot of this has to be approached on a local level. You have to meet the people on the ground that they're on, be they a local representative to Washington or whether they're citizens that you're trying to, implore to get involved here. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, we have a couple things on our side in this. There is massive opposition to trade deals among the public and growing opposition among Congress. Twice as many Americans think free trade agreements hurt than help, and 69% of Americans rightfully think that they cost jobs. But if this deal had to stand up to public scrutiny, it would be dead on arrival because it's full of gnarly corporate handouts that most Americans would find unconscionable, which is why we're faced with almost totally blackout of information from the United States Trade Representative, who's a guy named Ron Kirk, because that's really the only way they're going to be able to get this through. He has a big secret. The TPP isn't mainly about trade. Instead, it's a giant corporate power tool used to help the U.S. The U.S.'s largest corporations increase profits at the expense of workers, the environment, and even the government itself.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have to ask you, you sound like you know a lot of the content here, and one of the things we established earlier in the show is how hard it is to find out what's even in this thing. So what do you know, and how do you know it?
Well, we're using the previous free trade agreements as an example. Some of the documentation has been leaked by, somewhat ambiguous means. We know the rough structure of what's being negotiated. We know who's at the table, and we know what their interests are. In general, this deal has 26 different negotiating chapters, and only 2 of them deal with tariffs, which, as you may know, is the conventional realm of so-called free trade. The other 24 chapters deal with everything from intellectual property rules, which I believe you discussed earlier. Mm-hmm. In addition to copyrights, it also covers expanding drug prices and restricting internet freedom, to financial services deregulation, and they even put restrictions on how our legislators can act, like the potential ban of Buy America provisions, which recently drew the ire of 69 members of Congress, including Mr. Garamendi. So make no mistake, this is a massive deal being negotiated by corporations. There are nearly 600 registered corporate advisors with access to these negotiations, and they're being negotiated for corporations. So we know the parameters, and we know who's talking about it, and we can fill in the dots. The best example of this kind of misallocation of influence comes from February negotiations that we had in Los Angeles, or that they had in Los Angeles, when the USTR Kirk apparently strong-armed the host hotel into canceling a health group-sponsored luncheon, which sought to expose how Big Pharma's patent rights demands challenge AIDS treatment worldwide. Meanwhile, 20th Century Fox, who itself is lobbying for extreme copyright measures, was permitted to give trade negotiators a several-hour tour of their film production facilities, led by one of their lead trade lobbyists.
In fact, we heard from Maira Sutton that several of their group, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, were just trying to stay in the same hotel at the time that event took place, and their rooms were canceled, which essentially because EFF was not welcome there, where the trade agreement people were hanging out.
Yeah, it's really quite astonishing. The Office of the USTR has really put out strong rhetoric about how open of a process this has been, how accepting they are of input. But we don't have access to any of the negotiating materials, and as these examples illustrate, we aren't even really told about the negotiations. We have to figure out what's going on and find them and figure out what the hotel is, and try to make our presence and our beliefs known, and they're making it very hard for us to do that. We have had some successes. Earlier this month in Dallas, activists delivered over 42,000 petitions demanding the release of the text and more transparent negotiations, only for the USTR to turn around and use the receipts of these please be more transparent petitions to claim that he's actually being transparent. I said, I'm meeting with the people that have concerns about transparent, therefore I'm being transparent. So it's kind of a circular logic there. But in those events in Dallas, there was a week of events with several events, growing public support. We had a week of events in Southern California in February, and as I said, it's really only caused the USTR's office to up their rhetoric about transparency. They started touting these the fact that they're speaking with stakeholders more, and really they're just having these kind of token one-way discussions where our colleagues, Americans with legitimate concerns about threats to jobs or workers' rights or the environment, public health, are given the ear and a nice smile and nod and thanks for the input, and then they turn around and return to their negotiations with the full backing of their corporate cronies. Yeah,
the people that really have access. I'm talking to Tim Robertson. He's director of the California Fair Trade Coalition, and they do have an active petition right now online, and we'll be putting up a link for that on our website. It's there now for you at indeepradio.com. You've actually referred, Tim, to a couple different states, and you're actually part of a larger organization, Citizens Trade.
That's right. So, as you said, I direct the California Fair Trade Coalition, which is the California affiliate of a nationwide organization called the Citizens Trade Campaign, as you said. We support fair trade, as the title might suggest, which is a responsible way to expand trade, to expand the economy that doesn't just follow corporate interests. We want to use the expansion of trade to ensure that more jobs are created, that labor standards around the world are raised, and that environmental protections are stronger, and generally use the expansion of trade as a mechanism for good, not just a tool of corporations to increase their profits at great cost.
Well, let's talk about the situation in Washington. And I want to note on your website that in October of last year, you have an article that points out that even though Congress ratified 3 pending free trade agreements, and those were with Colombia, Korea, and Panama, that there was record Democratic opposition to that. And I wonder, with the names that you note as to which representatives signed on against this, are we seeing the standard blue dog, yellow dog division where we have the conservative Democrats who might as well be Republican for their voting record? Are they standing in the way of reasonable trade agreements?
Well, as you know, You're correct. We had record Democratic opposition to those trade agreements in October, particularly given that the president was Democratic. So we had, I think, something like 70% of Democrats opposed those deals on average, whereas typically, and true to form in October, nearly every Republican voted for them. It is part of a larger shift. These members of Congress see these polling data. They see, the reports from the effects of NAFTA and China joining the WTO, and how we're hemorrhaging jobs, particularly manufacturing jobs. Just a few weeks ago, 69 members of Congress, as I mentioned earlier, including Mr. Garamendi, sent a letter to the president demanding the protection of Buy America legislation, which would allow governments to prioritize job creation here as opposed to instead of just going for the lowest bid wherever it may be. Even people from the other side of the aisle. Last week, Representative Issa, who is historically very supportive of free trade agreements, actually published some of the leaked text and called on the administration to be more transparent. And just yesterday, Oregon Senator Ron Wyden introduced legislation in the Senate calling for the release of the TPP negotiating text.
Wait a minute, I'm still stuck back on Issa. We're talking about the same Darrell Issa, aren't we?
We are, yes. Strange bedfellows, huh? As his position in the Oversight Committee, he's asked for he he's concerned with the administration and their lack of transparency in these negotiations, as he should be. So, yeah, we don't always find a lot of common ground with Mr. Issa, but with here, we've got some. So the public and Congress are making it clear that these negotiations should not and will not be conducted in secrecy. But so far, such charges have fallen on deaf ears in the office of the USTR.
What about the White House? One of the things that strikes me is this is a tough topic for a lot of people to get a grasp on to begin with. And right now we're in an election cycle where people are already, do they pay attention to jobs? Are they paying attention to gay marriage? I mean, everything is fighting for attention and lobbying efforts. And we know that on the liberal progressive side of things, there's not a great deal of money. There's, everybody is stretched to the max. And I'm wondering if you feel like in the midst of all this election craziness, if the White House is weighing in on this at all, if they're giving it any attention, or if just by not speaking to it, they might be increasing the problem of nobody being aware of it.
I think you're onto something. The White House has been very, very silent about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. Going back to October, obviously they were pushing for the Korea, Colombia, and Panama free trade agreements that you mentioned, and aside from a couple of random statements and random speeches, they were pretty quiet about them after they were passing. It's kind of it seems like the president was kind of taking his medicine and getting these free trade agreement passed, so that he could move forward and talk about other things and still keep the support of his large corporate donors. We would love to see the president weighing in more on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As with all of the things that I've been discussing, we want greater discourse on these issues. We want, transparency in the negotiations, and we'd love to have a national dialogue about what free trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement in particular, is actually about, instead of, what we usually get about these boilerplate, just job creation, magic wand kind of bill. Which is really all the proponents ever really say about them. And not only is that not true, but it's doing an injustice to people that really deserve to know the truth about them.
Is the secrecy and lack of transparency here, is this, and I'm asking you with the understanding you're not a lawyer, and I don't want to put you in a position to have to give me a legal opinion, but just your impression, is this in violation of any statute? Is there perhaps a court remedy where a group of citizens go to court and say, hey, we're supposed to know what's going on with our own government? It just seems so impervious to any real review.
Well, you're right, Angie. I'm not a lawyer, and I'll qualify with that before I say. I think what I can say is that it's blatantly non-democratic. Thousands of Americans and Congress are standing up and saying we would like this to be a more open process. I can't get into the specifics as to what the law says on these issues, but I think in good faith, if we care about democracy and we care about the open exchange of ideas and information, it's certainly it's certainly disingenuous to wrong for the USTR to continue on his current course.
I know that you've been keeping an eye on trade agreements, for much longer than just this one. Are you seeing any arc of awareness with the fact that the public is starting to pay more attention? They are starting to care. For example, we've seen with the WTO and other important meetings around the world that there's more emphasis on removing accessibility, physical accessibility to the grounds where this is on. Protests are prepared for in advance. Are you seeing that sort of hyper awareness in the negotiation of the TPP? We've had a lot of successes over the last 10 years or so. There's a proposed free trade area of the Americas, which was a massive expansion of NAFTA. The current round of the World Trade Organization negotiations, called the Doha round, have both. The FTAA has been shut down. The WTO expansion negotiations have been grind to a halt.
And we are seeing, we are seeing a growth in interest in these issues. I think you're right when you said these issues are hard to wrap your head around, and it's taken a while for it to really start saturating into the public. But we've seen from those two examples in particular that once the public really gets wind of what's going on and really starts speaking out, which I think we're starting to see to an increasing degree right now, it gets harder and harder for these deals to get through, and frankly, it's how we stop them.
Is some of that education and the raised visibility coming through the work of the unions?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Is some of this increased visibility and increased education, are the unions involved heavily in getting that out there, getting the word out?
They are. We have a very, very broad coalition of people that work both with the California Fair Trade Coalition and nationwide on these issues. The labor movement is a big part of that. Environmental groups, public health groups, consumer advocates, faith groups, family farmers, democracy groups, democratic groups with a big D. We bring in lots of people who, frankly, these deals are so big and they have so many different issues that there's something in it that rubs everyone the wrong way, unless you're a corporatist ideologue. So we cast a wide net as to who we would like to work with, and we get great responses, and people are more than happy to get engaged and call their members of Congress and show up at rallies and participate in whatever way they can, and I think it's part of this larger movement that we're building that's making it harder and harder for these types of deals to be negotiated, and I think the outcome of that is unfortunately this tightening up of public access to such negotiations.
Well, that's a mixed optimistic message to end this on, so we are going to assume we're on the right track, and that's due to some of your efforts, too. And Tim Robertson, I thank you for taking time to talk to us today.
Great. It's an honor to be here.
Tim Robertson is director of the California Fair Trade Coalition, part of the Citizens Trade Groups, and we have all those links, including a link to their petition online at our website, indeepradio.com, so check it out there. Coming up in our next hour, foreclosure problems have become so severe that now one man in California has taken his life. We will talk to his widow, and we'll talk to a number of activists who talk about how to tackle the banks and loan managers that may be keeping you away from a righteous solution to your foreclosure problem. That's a wrap for this hour, and we will see you in the next hour here on In Deep Radio. Don't forget to follow us online at In Deep Radio on Twitter and In Deep with Angie Coiro on Facebook.
Private parts. They want us to do what they say, but I'd rather live my own damn way. We'll take our culture back someday, but it's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. It's gonna get worse before it gets better, but I know it's gonna get better.
Thanks for tuning in this week to In Deep with Angie Coiro, a production of Talkback Studios. You can get more information about us at indeepradio.com. And while you're there, you can become a member and support our work. There's a link there to contact us, too, with any questions or feedback. We're developing a series on mental health issues in our country, especially in this economy, and we'd love to have you be part of that. Please send us your topic suggestions, your stories, and your questions through our website. Click the contact button at indeepradio.com. Join us again this time next week for 2 more hours of in-depth conversation. I'm Angie Coiro. We'll see you then. You're listening to WPWC 1480 AM, Dumfries, Virginia. We Act Radio, home of Washington's progressive working community.